So the other day, Stephanie, my co-host for Borrowing Brilliance, which is a segment of our podcast Dragon Mind, sent me a meme that really got me thinking about homebrew in 5th edition D&D. It really got my brain going on all the things I've discovered about homebrew, and why a lot of the times it just doesn't work. Which makes conversations like this complicated, because one thing I've noticed about the D&D community, at least a very loud part of it, is that there seems to be this kind of worship over the idea of homebrewing. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I do agree that homebrew can take a good D&D game and make it excellent, when done well. However, when done poorly, it makes things confusing, frustrating, and potentially makes a game a lot less fun. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and today we're going to be breaking down 3 things to consider when designing your own homebrew game mechanics for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Before tumbling too deep down the rabbit hole though, like always, I think it's good to start by defining some of our terms. Homebrew is one of these really vague colloquialisms of the community, and it can really reference anything that's been designed by an individual that isn't part of an official source by Wizards of the Coast. It can include custom settings, character classes, subclasses, magic items, monsters, spells, and really what we're focusing on today, game mechanics. Now, when we're talking about game mechanics, specifically what we're talking about are overarching rules that are part of the game's system. While you can create a custom magic item that you give to one of your players, that might affect the game experience, might affect the power balance of the party versus monsters. That magic item isn't going to change the choices of the other characters in the party. At least in the same way as, say, changing how actions work or how movement works. A big overarching rule like one of those. Throughout today's video, I'm going to be referencing a few other games, because when you're designing homebrew, one thing to keep in mind is that you're really a game designer. Maybe not a professional one where you're getting paid to make a lot of this stuff. Maybe you are. But in any case, these lessons are game design lessons, and you can learn a lot of awesome game design lessons from other games as well. One of the ones I'm going to start with is Magic the Gathering, another game made by Wizards of the Coast. Every so often there's a new expansion pack where new cards are released. Those new cards definitely change the game, in that they change the power balance and they change the number of choices that players have when constructing decks. But having a new card to choose when creating a deck is very different than, say, changing how the underlying mechanics work. Like, one card might be really powerful, it might have really good stats or something, but that doesn't change how attacking works or how blocking works. We're talking about changing an underlying mechanic. And as such, the changes that are going to happen are going to be much more drastic. And like I said, a lot of times by homebrewing your own game rules, you can really highlight either what's enjoyable about your game, or have rules that help emphasize your game's aesthetic tone. But if they're poorly designed, they can make the game a lot less fun to play. So with that preface out of the way, let's start with consideration number 1. This might be counterintuitive, and I kind of expect to be burned at the stake for this, but I would say if you're serious about creating strong homebrew, it'll be such a service to you and your table if you become skilled with the rules as written. And I know a lot of players start the game because they're really excited about creating their own rules or homebrew setting. And this is why I'm really pinning down, this conversation is about homebrew mechanics. If you want to create a homebrew setting or something, all that lore, all that flavor is a different beast than taking into account the rulings you're going to make and the rules that all of your players are expected to play by. There are a few reasons why I highly recommend starting your DMing journey by really getting good at the rules as written. First, if you go to homebrew something, you need to know what the actual rules in the game are already so you don't create a homebrew fix to something that actually exists. That was kind of the meme that Stephanie sent me. And I've definitely seen it. It kind of adds weird tension at the table when a DM thinks they're like really genius because, oh, I have this homebrew thing. And then a player opens up and they're like, well, here's the page in the PHB where it's already a rule. And it can lead to the DM feeling embarrassed, which then has other consequences in how they rule their game. The only problem with this is really kind of like an emotional, energetic one, but still, it's a problem nonetheless, and one that can be avoided if you get good at learning the rules. And I'm not saying you have to have a comprehensive, encyclopedic knowledge of every single thing in the player's handbook, but I have found that being familiar with the game's rules by experiencing them in play and experiencing what it's like to adjudicate them informs you on how to create strong homebrew that, again, heightens what your players love about the game and smooths out any pain points where they might find something annoying or overly complicated. Another thing that I find that understanding the rules as written helps with is understanding the second, third, and fourth order consequences to one of your homebrew rules. A good example I can think of in 5th edition D&D is two-weapon fighting. This one is pretty well despised throughout the community, so much so that 1D&D has already offered a playtest fix. The original rule is that if you have a light weapon in your main hand and a light weapon in your offhand, you can use your bonus action to make an additional attack with your offhand weapon. From an action economy standpoint and from a pure damage standpoint, this ends up being a really weak option, especially compared to other fighting styles that have greater feat support, like two-weapon fighting with Great Weapon Master, or using a polearm with Polearm Master and Sentinel, or using a hand crossbow with Crossbow Expert. Not only is two-weapon fighting clunky, it also just lacks support to make it viable. And because of that, you have a lot of better choices and one worse choice. So a little while ago, I saw a few different content creators and posters on forums suggesting a homebrew fix where really you just double the number of attacks that you get. So say you're a two-weapon fighter, normally you'd get 2 attacks, 1 with each weapon. If you're a fighter and you get extra attack, you get 4 attacks. If you get high enough in level, let's say you get 3 extra attacks, you might get 6 or 8 attacks because of your 2 weapons. I saw a lot of different criticism toward this approach because mathematically it makes it a superior option, especially when you start considering multi-classing. And because of that, it takes the weak option and makes it really the best option. And that's what I mean by second and third order consequences. Yes, you've fixed two-weapon fighting by making it stronger, but if you make it too strong, now a lot of players are just going to select it, and if every player starts to optimize, it makes gameplay really stale. Actually, there's this awesome quote by Soren Johnson and Sid Meier, who are the designers of the Civilization series, that just say, given the choice, players will optimize the fun out of a game. And I've certainly found that to be true. I've definitely seen a lot of DMs homebrew something to create additional choices, but those choices become so good that it makes other choices just not worth taking. And that's really unhealthy for a game, because if you have too few choices, then it really feels like you aren't playing, you're just kind of on autopilot. That being said, too many choices aren't better. We'll talk about that in the next consideration. But just to sum this up, I'm not saying that rules as written is the best approach or the one that you have to stick with, but I definitely think if you're a newer DM, or you're finding a lot of times your players are making corrections to your rulings because of what it says in the player's handbook, might not be a bad idea to at least be familiar with the rules as written by experiencing it in gameplay. Alright, consideration number 2, which I really think is the main core of my point for today's video, is to consider complexity versus depth. Really, when I'm looking at homebrew, one thing I'm always considering is how more or less complicated it's making the game, and how much depth its addition creates or gets rid of. This is another one where I want to define our terms real quick. In game design, I've found that a few people have a few different definitions for these, but for today, the definitions I'm going to go with are: complexity refers to how difficult it is for a player to understand the rules and their implications, whereas depth is the number of emergent, experientially different possibilities or meaningful choices that come out of one rule set. And this isn't supposed to be like, more or less complicated is better or worse, but we do want to pay attention to how that complexity relates to the depth that's created through its inclusion. Again, we're going to look at 3 different games in order to start talking about homebrew in D&D: checkers, chess, and Magic the Gathering. Of these 3, pretty obviously checkers is the most simple. There's the least amount of rules to understand, and because of that, it can be a little easier for players to grasp what the implications of an opponent's moves are, and therefore what moves you can take with your pieces. The game isn't as complicated, but it also lacks some depth because there aren't as many emergent, experientially different possibilities. And because of that, there are less meaningful choices that you have to make. Does that make checkers a worse game than the other 2? Well, that's where it comes down to personal preference. Fun is a subjective thing. Maybe if you're playing with someone who's younger, checkers is going to be easier for them to understand and a lot less frustrating. But there might be a lot of players that find checkers boring and they want a little bit more of a challenge. And again, this is like reiterating the strength of homebrew. The reason why you would use homebrew is to tune your individual game to create the best experience possible for your individualized table. And that table may even change tastes over time. For example, the group of players I have now like a game that's a little more complicated, but when I first started playing with them, I tried to keep things real simple so the game could grow as they grew as players. Getting back to our 3 games, let's now look at chess. Chess has more complexity. Different pieces can move and take enemy pieces in different ways. Because of that, there is a lot more depth to the game, and it can be much more difficult for a player to understand the implications of an opponent's move. Because of that, there are a lot more meaningful choices to make, and for a lot of people, this is like the right balance of having a game that's complex but also deep. And finally, let's look at Magic the Gathering. As of the time of this recording, Magic the Gathering has over 20,000 unique cards that have been printed. So imagine chess, but with 20,000 unique pieces. That is a whole lot of complexity, and possibly a whole lot of depth. Now, this is where I want to break down how depth is all about meaningful choices, not just the number of choices. For example, if you look at Magic the Gathering, there are a lot of different formats you can play by. And depending on the format, that changes the kind of cards you can put in your deck, how big your deck is, if you can include 4 copies or 1 copy, and different players have different preferences on which format they play by. For our conversation, I'm going to be talking about Magic's standard format, just because it'll highlight this point the best. So if you're looking at standard right now, there are about 2,500 cards in play, and I'm talking about Dominaria United being the latest set. This is recorded before Brothers War comes out. Now, you might be thinking 2,500 choices, that's a lot of emergent possibilities, but how many meaningful choices are made there? If you look at like the top competitive decks, you'll start to notice the same cards popping up more and more frequently. In current standard, I often see Liliana of the Veil, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, Titan of Industry. You see a lot of these same cards pop up, which also means despite having 2,500 possible pieces, there is a fraction of them that are more meaningful choices, or as Magic players will say, more viable or competitive choices. Sure, you can enter a tournament with an unoptimized deck, but you're not going to perform as well as someone who has better cards. So now you have to ask yourself, Magic is a much more complex game, but I would argue that the proportion of its increased complexity doesn't necessarily match the proportion of how much depth is created through the introduction of those 2,500 cards. Now, I love Magic. A lot of players do. I like Magic more than chess. But some players may get frustrated by the complexity of Magic. Whereas chess, all you need is a $20 board, and you can have a lot of fun between you and another player. So how does this relate to Dungeons & Dragons? Well, a lot of times I find that DMs want to make a name for themselves by adding in a lot of homebrew, either to create more choices or to balance the game. And they end up adding a lot of complexity, but it doesn't necessarily mean more meaningful choices that make the game more enjoyable. In fact, I think it's invaluable for a DM to develop the skill to watch what excites their players about the game and what frustrates their players about the game, and when they're considering their homebrew, to take all those things into account. Too many times I've seen a DM get really excited about a mechanic they came up with, but it's because they're excited to see it implemented, not necessarily something that their players are excited about playing with. And I've definitely made this mistake too. For example, a game mechanic I thought would be interesting because of my experience with The Witcher was having a homebrew rule for potion toxicity, where by drinking a bunch of potions, players would now have to be careful about how many potions they consumed, or else they might accidentally poison themselves. Well, what that led to is players just not drinking potions. That's an example of a second order consequence of creating this homebrew mechanic that, you know, made the game a little less interesting, because now my players don't want to drink any potions. Now, if I also say took away healing spells from the game, now that would also change how players approach potions. But a second order consequence might be players becoming suddenly really meticulous about gameplay in order to avoid damage, so much so that their fear of getting damaged might slow down the game so much that it becomes a less fun experience. Now, a homebrew mechanic I did come up with that my players really like is that when a creature makes a melee attack, if they roll a nat 1 on their attack roll, that provokes an opportunity attack. The first order consequence is just that there's more damage being exchanged, but also now players have to start to consider things like, is this worth my reaction? Or is it better to hold on to my reaction for things like shield and counterspell? What about our positioning? If we start to swarm an enemy, that enemy, if it provokes an opportunity attack, all of a sudden all the melee characters around them can get opportunity attacks on them. However, now there's an additional game to be played. If everyone's going to swarm and cluster, they're going into fireball formation. And a clever enemy may sacrifice one of its lieutenants in order to hit the party with a massive efficient AoE. It's an example of how there's a little bit to remember in that nat 1s provoke opportunity attacks, but there's all this depth now to consider when playing a game in one of my worlds. All right, on to consideration number 3. This one is one that I know Ian talked about in his world building video, which we'll link in the description below. And that one is iterate. Whether it's creative writing or video content creation or homebrew game design, the best art is a result of iteration. You may strike gold the first time, but you probably won't. Homebrew is one of those things where you want to develop it using the feedback from your players over time. You'll mess it up, you'll make mistakes, you'll learn a lot of lessons, and the more you pick yourself back up, the more skillful you will get, as long as it's all coming from the right place. Where I think a lot of DMs get stuck is they want to put their personal identity stamp, so to speak, on their table's gameplay. They want to take ownership of it, and they want to be known and praised for how genius their homebrew is. These are all I-based reasons, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I do find it's going to limit your success in implementing homebrew for your players. As a DM, you're in a position of service. You're serving your players a really strong, memorable game experience. And that doesn't mean like you failed, you're a terrible DM if you don't accomplish that. But if that's your intention going in, then I find the amount of growth you'll experience will be more than someone who's kind of DMing for more selfish reasons. That doesn't mean that you're not a player too. Part of the table you're servicing is yourself. But I found that when I create fun homebrew that really gets my players thinking and gets my players excited, I get more excited too as a result. And despite having certain tools like metrics, like damage or healing points or anything like that, really I find that game design is more art than science. And again, it's about tuning in to what your players value at the table. And homebrew is an extension of the culture that you cultivate at your table. So those are my thoughts and considerations on designing homebrew at the moment. Now I want to know your thoughts. What homebrew has your DM implemented that you've really liked? Or do you have any disaster stories? Let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, let YouTube know. Hit like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.